Hello, everyone. I'm very sorry that I can't be with you in person. I would love to be there. My name is Dr. Jane Battersby. I'm a urban food systems and food security researcher from the University of Cape Town, South Africa. And today I'm going to be talking to you about incorporating food and nutrition sensitivity into spatial planning in the interests of health and nutrition. And I'm going to be speaking from an African perspective. So what we're facing is a new reality of food and nutrition insecurity. As you'll see from the graph from Teft et al.'s work for the World Bank, you'll see that increasingly food insecurity is prevalent in urban as well as rural areas. And in fact, in the least developed countries in the world, there are higher proportions of food insecurity in the urban areas than rural areas. Not only that, we're seeing a changing manifestation of food insecurity. We're witnessing the increasing dual or triple burden of malnutrition. And if you look at the map from the Global Nutrition Report, you'll see that the countries in which the triple burden is really being concentrated are predominantly in the African context. So diets are changing fast. Food insecurity doesn't simply look like hunger anymore. And as we're starting to think about this, it's becoming increasingly apparent that it's not simply about poverty. It's about the impact of the food environment and how the food environment is adapting, particularly in the urban areas, and about the manifestation of multidimensional poverty. And so I'll talk to those themes in this presentation. I think the reality is that we need to act and we need to plan now, not for our presents, but actually our urban futures. And our urban futures may not look like what we think they do. So this graph from a paper by Battersby et al. Shows the population distribution by settlement size projected into the future in Africa. And as you'll see, the majority of urban growth in the African context over the next few decades is going to be concentrated not necessarily on those mega cities, the Lagoses of the world, but on these smaller secondary and tertiary cities. The question is, what does that then mean for planning? What does it mean for urban economies? What does it mean for infrastructure? What does that mean for urban governance in these spaces where capacities may be lower? We're also dealing with the context of a massively burgeoning youth population, which has a number of attendant challenges. And then factoring in having to be adaptive and responsive to climate change. And how that impacts our food systems, but also how it impacts our cities and our economies and our lives within cities. And so we need to be mindful of these changes as we make decisions now, because the decisions we make now will shape future pathways of urbanization, future pathways of food security, of resilience, of all of those things. And so, like I said, the way in which people are talking about food security has been shifting to a much wider focus on particularly on food environments. And this image is from Turner et al. From 2018. And they look at this kind of dynamic between the food system and the personal domain in forming the food environment. And saying it's not just enough now to think about income poverty as determining diets and food insecurity. And nor is it simply about poor choices. We just need to educate people to eat better. But it's about the food environment and the way in which we interact with that, which I think is a really useful starting point for thinking about how we do things differently, but I don't think it goes quite far enough. Because what we're doing is we're looking tightly at this relationship, the two green dots of consumer and food environment, and thinking about what needs to change in each of those to affect positive change. But those relationships are being mediated by a much wider set of relationships, about questions about where this fits into policy, where it fits into geography. What's the impact of infrastructure? What are the impacts of regulation, not simply food system regulation, but other forms of regulation, and how the economy all feeds into this. And so I think the argument is that actually what we need to do is situate the conversation about food and nutrition security, nutrition health, in a much wider urban health framing and urban infrastructure framing. So I'll go on to explain what I mean in the rest of the presentation. Because what we're witnessing from the work we're doing across the African continent is that spatial planning profoundly impacts food nutrition security. Got two images, got an image here of two things commonly sold in a marketplace, and with these eggs, and you can see the packaging of the eggs. There's a pathway of eggs from peri-urban areas into the city via bicycle traders that is often not really thought about. So these, like how the infrastructure works. All the Coca-Cola bottles are selling cooking fuel in unit sizes that people can afford. So there's some interesting dynamics happening there. And I think if we look at seriously about urban planning, spatial planning more broadly, we can see how planning decisions shape the availability, accessibility in all of its forms, households' ability to utilize food, the stability of that food system, and then the two new dimensions the high-level panel of experts added in last year, of agency and of sustainability. And if food security and the food system is shaped by all of those things, then it means there's a serious role for spatial planning in determining food nutrition security outcomes. So I think there's two things that we need to think about. The first is about food-specific planning. And so many times local and regional governments will tell you that they don't have a significant role, a significant mandate. And yet the actions of the state fundamentally shape many aspects of the food system. And so, for example, we think about urban agriculture zoning, we think about the need to perhaps try and protect peri-urban agricultural land from urban encroachment. And so there's a food-specific planning element there. Middle images of a food processing, micro-level food processing in Zimbabwe. This has been rendered illegal by the planning system. The planning system views food processing as something that should only happen in an area that's industrially zoned, envisaging a large-scale industrial food system. And yet this is the reality of how most people in lower income areas access their maize meal. There needs to be adaptation in zoning, in planning, in order to render these systems legal and make them more efficient and effective for the poor. Likewise with markets. We have markets that are officially mandated, markets that are acting outside of mandates, markets that are kind of in this peripheral zone. There are many things that local governments can do in order to enable better functioning of markets and infrastructure. So I know there's work being done by GAIN at the moment about keeping markets working. So these are kind of food-specific planning elements, but there are also substantial food-sensitive planning elements. Got an image here from Kisumu in Kenya of just how a lot of food is getting delivered. What kind of infrastructure supports these kinds of small-scale delivery processes? A lot of the infrastructure planning that we see going in place, particularly around roads, is the large highways that connect distant cities in order to enable kind of large-scale trade. But the impact of the neglect of local roads and local transport infrastructure means that this food system is somewhat undermined. And so if we were to start to embed a kind of food sensitivity in thinking about what kind of food system is being privileged and marginalized by different kinds of planning decisions, I think we could perhaps enhance the food system that's operating. You got two pictures of a supermarket from Kitwe in Zambia. The first picture was taken in 2015, and you can see this interrelationship between the formal and the informal. When we went back to the site in 2017, all the traders had been cleared and moved into what was already acknowledged to be an overcrowded, dysfunctional market in order to sanitize and modernize the street. This was not a food decision, but it's a decision that profoundly shaped the food system. So the argument we're trying to make is that there's a need to embed a sensitivity to food systems impacts in planning decisions that are not about food. To give another example, sorry for the noise of the children in the background. To give another example, in the South African context, we've seen this rapid expansion of the supermarket sector. As you can see, in 1994, the green dots represent where a supermarket is. In 1994, there were very few supermarkets, and by 2013, there'd been this veritable explosion of supermarkets. This all came about through planning decisions that largely were giving planning permission for shopping malls to develop. And this was made as a local economic development plan. And there was no consideration given to the food system consequences of that. The challenge with this is that it's been systematically undermining the small scale and informal sector, which is the sector that many people depend on for their food. And so we need to ask questions about what kind of system are we imagining and what kind of system are we planning for? Because as you'll see from this image, people in cities seamlessly merge formal and informal. And so I think we need to think about planning from a lived experience perspective. How is it that people are accessing and using food? What's determining their choices, both in the food system, but also in their lived experience, and work to enhance those systems. And so my fundamental belief is that if we're going to build resilient food systems into the future, it needs to be based on the premise of maintaining food system diversity. Because in the consequence of climate change, in the consequence of political threat, different aspects of the food system are vulnerable and resilient at different times. And so if we're going to make a food system that works for people, it needs to maintain that kind of diversity. We need to think about people's lived experiences and how we embed food sensitivity into the kinds of planning that are done at the municipal level. The image here is of a woman preparing her evening meal and looking at the kinds of infrastructure that she has available to her and how that then shapes the decisions she's able to make about safely, affordably feeding her family. And so you can see that all of these factors, things like sanitation, things like access to energy, things like access to water, things like waste management, all fundamentally shape the choices that people are able to make about food. And so you might have enough income to buy a nutritious diet. The food might be there. But if you can't store and cook it safely, if you don't have energy security, for example, it becomes very difficult to eat healthily. And people then move towards the highly processed foods that are often going to be deleterious to health and sometimes more expensive. And so we really need to build in this kind of lived experience and thinking about embedding food sensitivity into settlement upgrading, into planning of new areas, etc. And so to conclude, I think at the heart of what I'm trying to say, and I apologize for the background noise from my children, at the heart of what I'm trying to say is that if we start to embed food-specific and food-sensitive considerations into spatial planning, it has multiple benefits. It enhances food and nutrition security. It increases food systems resilience. And also believe that if done correctly, it starts to embed principles of equity and sustainability into planning more broadly, because it's forcing us to ask, who is this system being designed for? What are the consequences of any planning decisions? And what should we be doing in the interests of meeting the SDGs, etc.? I think if we start to add food into the wider spatial planning agenda, I think it can have a series of very positive outcomes for cities more broadly and territories more broadly. Because as Wayne Roberts used to say, ultimately, a city is what it eats. Thank you very much.